Deep in the forest, far from any sign of civilization, there is a cabin whose windows never let the light invade entirely. It rests among ancient roots, as if it had been planted there before time gained a name or meaning. Those who enter are not looking for shelter from the rain or cold, but a break from the noises that life brings. But it is precisely there that the silence dissolves into deep murmurs, whispers that seem to emerge from the rotten wood of the walls. It is as if each step on the floor marks the beginning of something irreversible. The ground gives way a little, not because of fragility, but as if hiding more than it can bear. He feels watched, but nothing moves beyond the shadows that seem to run through the cracks, always with the weight of a gaze that never closes its eyes. The air weighs more than a body should bear, and each breath is an effort not to abandon everything and flee. But to flee to where, if the door behind seems to multiply like illusory replicas in a cracked mirror? Here there is no noise of animals, not even the rustling of leaves. Instead, the muffled sound of his own heart pulsates, paced and irregular, as if trying to keep up with a strange rhythm imposed by the house. Fear, normally subtle, turns into physical presence, clutching the chest, inserting questions. What is behind that cracked wall? How long can a person contain their own panic without exploding? The thoughts, once clear, shuffle like twisted trees, and the most painful memories find echoes in this woody pitch. A forgotten photograph on the fireplace, an unfinished note stuck in the window, small traces of others who have been here, perhaps trying to find themselves, or running away from something bigger than loneliness itself. The strange thing is that the door never locks, never creaks. It just stays close enough that the simple gesture of opening it seems easy, but too far away to reach when you want it most. Time dilates, the hours are shaped by the anxiety that grows between the walls and seems to announce that one is not alone, even when one does not see anyone. The anguish thickens like fog, and the mind whispers, "How long can you endure living with your own fear for company?" His own eyes begin to see too much. His skin stands on end at the memory of voices that have never been heard outside of there. It is as if, little by little, the hut translates everything that the senses cannot process, exposing the reverse side of silent desires. The effort to maintain reason is a daily battle, sometimes victorious, sometimes completely lost. The feeling of being watched never ceases, and the emptiness of the forest only adds to its weight. Nothing in the house is immediately aggressive. Terror does not bite, it just slowly licks the conscience until it finds itself completely bewildered. There is no respite for the weary mind, there is no way out for those who have already locked their own hope outside. It is impossible to know how long one has really remained within those walls, minutes, days. Time is as malleable as the sanity of those who listen to the breathing of the environment, even without wind or any life. Even those unspeakable feelings, stored in the back of memory, seem to take shape there. Perhaps the worst part is understanding that in that cabin the screams are never external. What echoes through the corridors is the failed attempt to silence one's own mind, an endless cycle of distortions and doubts, in which the way out seems to exist only in the memory of what was gone before crossing that door. Because the hut does not physically impede the passage. What really binds are the invisible chains shaped by old fears and the refusal to face what cannot be named. There are places where silence does not exist, and sometimes the greatest dread is to realize that, even surrounded by wood and shadows, the only noise to echo is that of one's own weaknesses, resonating until everything outside disappears and only the company of what could never be forgotten remains. Some people carry their restlessness as if they were wearing a heavy coat in the middle of summer, unable to leave it behind. Ethan Foster was that type. He grew up in Seattle, a city of endless nights in the rain, where the lights of the buildings illuminated the fog more than the streets below. Ever since he was a child, he had the feeling that the world was a brittle ground beneath his feet, as if at any moment something could give way. His parents were university professors, rarely at home. He frequented the school's quiet library, seeking refuge among bookshelves that promised answers to questions he didn't even know exactly how to ask. He carried a chronic insecurity, an irrational fear of not being enough for those he loved or even for himself. At 28, Ethan was a freelance translator, a lonely job that dovetailed with his need to keep the world at a distance safe. He lived in a small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, surrounded by plants that struggled to survive on the windowsills. The space was compact, cluttered with stacks of books, scribbled notebooks, and forgotten cups. There, he felt the familiar comfort of isolation, but also the constant threat of his own thoughts. The recent breakup of a relationship seemed to crumble Ethan's already fragile mental balance. Madison, his ex-girlfriend, had been a beacon for his murky nights, and now the apartment seemed too big, the clocks beating on the walls like the beating of an anxious heart. Each morning, anxiety crawled through the ribs, turning the routine into a succession of small rituals to try to control the chaos inside. It was after a sleepless night that Ethan found the proposal on an online forum, a reservation of secluded cabins near Montana's border with Canada. The ad promised total seclusion, hidden forest trails, and unspoiled landscapes. The idea of disappearing for a while, away from the pressures of work, the gaze of neighbors and the recent past haunted her mind until it took the form of a concrete plan. In a few days, he packed the car with some clothes, his favorite books, and enough supplies to survive 2 weeks alone. The road to Kalispell, in northwestern Montana, seemed eternal. Pine forests slid out the window as the music on the radio became just noise. Gradually, urban construction gave way to misty clearings and small towns with forgotten names. Whitefish, Columbia Falls. A light rain accompanied part of the route, enveloping the car in mists as if a curtain separated Ethan from the rest of the world, protecting him, or perhaps warning him. The final destination was a set of cabins near the Flathead National Forest, a region known for its deep lakes and poorly marked trails. The dirt road, lined with ravines and fallen logs, ended in front of a jagged clearing, where the hut seemed almost swallowed up by the vegetation that grew disorderly around it. The first impression was one of abandonment. The place, although advertised as a modern refuge, exuded an atmosphere of oblivion and suspended time. The dark wooden facade was scratched, the roof accumulating moss. No fence delimited the property. The interior was simple: a single room, a stone fireplace, 2 old armchairs made of crumpled leather, a small table with cup marks. Small, dirty windows framed fragments of forest. A narrow corridor led to a bedroom with a worn wooden bed and a faded bedspread. On top of the bedside cabinet, someone had forgotten an old pocket watch, stopped at 11:05. Ethan settled his things, forcing himself to believe that this loneliness was therapeutic. The following days would be dedicated to writing, long walks, and attempts to find each other again. Gradually, however, the isolation he sought began to show dangerous limits. From the first night, something seemed out of place. The creaking of the floor was constant. It intensified when the house cooled. On the second day, he noticed that his boots, which he had left lined up by the door, were in positions changed in the morning, a detail so small that it could have gone unnoticed were it not for his habit of controlling everything around. Later, as he prepared his coffee, he noticed dust marks on the tabletop, as if thin fingers had drawn damp lines during the night. The surrounding forest was opaque, noisy at times, and suddenly drowned in absolute silence. One afternoon, walking aimlessly, Ethan found footprints near the shore of a small lake that was not on the map. The marks were too long for an ordinary animal, almost human, but with a strange shape, curved and elongated. He tried to forget, justifying it as erosion or a joke of some previous visitor. That night, as he read to distract his mind, the wind seemed to whisper his name through the half-open window. The sound was indistinct, hoarse, but enough to chill his bones. Before going to sleep, she checked braids and curtains, trying to ward off the growing discomfort. Every detail seemed to take on a hidden meaning. The uneven brightness of the room, the sweet smell that came from the unlit fireplace, the fact that one of the paintings on the wall, an old photograph of the lake in spring, was always crooked, no matter how many times he adjusted it. Something was out of the ordinary, a presence that was not entirely physical. Memories of Seattle grew more and more distant, replaced by the cold that rose up the floor and a sense of constant vigilance. Ethan wanted to believe that he would find peace there. But as the nights wore on, it became impossible to ignore the idea that perhaps he was not alone among those trees. He didn't know it yet, but he was already part of a plot intertwined with the darkness itself. Time, in that hut buried among pine trees and fog, became soft and malleable. The forgotten pocket watch next to the bed looked more like an adornment than a reliable instrument. Ethan often watched it, hoping to find some mark of real time in it, but the hours there didn't behave as they should. On the third night, he woke up with something more than silence. It was a subtle, low, indistinct noise, as if someone or something had scraped their nails at the bottom of the house. The sound stretched for minutes, oscillating between far and near, causing involuntary tremors in his body. He tried to reason, to dispel fear by rationalizing. Perhaps branches brushing against the walls, perhaps a small animal looking for warmth. But in the morning, there was no fallen branch or sign of an animal. What he found, when washing the mug he had used the night before, was a fine mark, as if a finger soiled with dirt had traced an imperfect circle in the pottery. With each dawn, the clearing seemed to shrink, the trees leaning slowly toward the house, the dense shadows slipping through the windows. One afternoon he decided to go for a walk towards the lake, trying to clear his mind. Along the way, he noticed small red ribbons tied to branches, each marked with unknown and illegible symbols. The wind was blowing lightly, but as it approached the ribbons, the air was still, as if that small patch of forest rejected any intruder. The feeling of being followed accompanied him. He looked back, saw only the path of dry leaves, but the certainty that he was not alone was at the base of his neck. He hurried back to the hut, swearing he heard the characteristic crack of footsteps, too light for a man, too heavy for a small animal. On the way back, along the main trail, he came across an old pickup truck, stopped on the side of the dirt road. A man in a felt hat, sunburned skin and eyes fixed in the rearview mirror turned when he noticed Ethan. The stranger lifted his chin in a restrained greeting. Not wanting to sound intrusive, Ethan mumbled a greeting and forced a smile. The local, if he was one, poked his rear tire with his boot and bluntly remarked that those huts didn't usually hold visitors for long. There were people who came and went, but few lasted more than a week. Ethan tried to inquire why, but the man looked away, pretending to care about the toolbox. Near the entrance to the forest, an elderly woman was pushing a wheelbarrow, loaded with damp firewood. Her eyes were two opaque dots, fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. Ethan helped push the cart to the wire gate on the neighboring property. As she thanked him, she held his arm, her thin, almost transparent hand, squeezing that frail body more than would be possible, and whispered that certain things, when they want to be seen, always end up finding a way. I told him not to approach the lake when the fog settled, and never to sleep with the window open. Her touch left Ethan's skin cold, as if he inherited, just by contact, the superstition embedded in each syllable. That night, the wind brought the indistinct sound again, now accompanying very slow steps on the steps of the balcony. He opened his eyes, motionless, waiting for the noise to stop. The sound crept close to the door, which groaned slightly, even though it was locked. No shadow outlined by the crack, no animal, no explanation. Ethan's heart was beating fast, reverberating in his chest and ears. When he finally mustered up the courage to get up, he saw that the crooked picture on the wall now had a small scratch below the glass, as if something had tried to tear it off. The next day, he decided to explore the surroundings. He found by the lake an old sign without letters, covered with slime. The reflection in the water was not clear. The banks trembled, as if they had a life of their own. On the opposite bank, something moved the branches. Just for a second, a slender, grey-skinned figure passed between the trees, so fast that it could have been just an illusion. But Ethan saw it, a strange glint in the creature's eyes, as if reflecting all the light the forest refused. The figure disappeared, swallowed by the shadows and silence. He left with the tingling sensation in his hands, fighting the irrational impulse to run. At the nearest market in Whitefish, Ethan asked the cashier, a silent boy with a pale face, if the area was famous for legends or strange stories. The young man replied only that no one in the city liked that forest, and quickly changed the subject. As he tried to dig some deeper, he was ignored, leaving Ethan with the impression that everyone knew something, but no one was willing to share. Each night, the noises returned, alternating between small crackles and the dull tremor of something heavy passing over the roof. The sweet aroma of the cabin's interior grew stronger, mixing notes of wet earth and something indefinable, reminiscent of copper and smoke. Objects continued to move minimally. Glasses switched, curtains swayed when the wind didn't blow. The door creaked for no reason. Ethan felt that the house breathed, and the forest somehow also paid attention to everything around. The bewilderment came not only from the strange phenomena, but from the reactions of the few with whom he came across. All the information was incomplete. All the advice came loaded with ancestral fears, leaving Ethan with the certainty that the danger was unconventional. Each night, doubt was diluted with reason, and the mystery of the cabin grew, along with the deadly feeling of not belonging, but no longer being able to let it go. The isolation of the cabin, instead of calming Ethan's mind, turned into a suffocating labyrinth that impelled him to search for answers. During a morning of light rain, tired of the nocturnal noises and the constant feeling of being watched, he decided to turn over every corner of that old building. It started in the basement, a damp and cramped space lit only by the beam of the flashlight. At the bottom, wooden boxes were piled up covered with moldy cloths. In one of them, he found albums of old photographs covered in dust and damp marks. The images, in worn black and white, showed families posing in front of the same hut, serious faces and blank stares. In almost all of them there was some subtly displaced presence, a dark figure in the corners of the picture, a strange reflection. In the windows of the house in the background, sometimes distorted shapes in the fog that enveloped the forest. Among the albums, a thick paper envelope contained documents, a contract for the purchase of the cabin dated 1919 in the name of a certain Harold Foster. The handwriting was familiar, and Ethan was transfixed when he realized the last name. Digging deeper, he also found handwritten letters, apparently from a woman named Evelyn, addressed to Harold. In the crooked and distressed lines, Evelyn reported sounds coming from the forest, disturbing dreams and the feeling of losing her own identity, as if the place corrupted the will of the residents over time. Desperate messages appeared in the last pages. We are not the ones who live in the house. It lives in us. The name Foster repeated itself like an ancestral echo, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. Had his family any forgotten connection with that place? He went upstairs, carrying the albums and the envelope, and spent hours trying to put the pieces together. The most recent photos, although old, showed increasingly distant and deformed figures, almost erased by exposure or time. In one of them, Ethan saw a face he recognized, the elderly woman he had met on the road, much younger, next to a man with a hard expression. On the back, someone had scribbled, "Evelyn and Harold, summer 1922. The connection grew, intimate and unsettling. Among the papers, he found a diary bound with leather cracked by time, whose last pages were scratched and dirty, as if they had been written in despair. The accounts spoke of sleepless nights and of an entity that walked among the trees, crossed the lakes, and whispered promises to those who dared to respond. The text changed handwriting in the final passages, becoming abrupt, almost illegible, describing the vision of a tall, thin, eye-burning in shadow creature, and the oath never to leave the hut again, because no one leaves here of his own free will. The heavy air in the house grew worse with each discovery, as if the revelations activated old hidden mechanisms. As Ethan flipped through the letters and looked at the pictures, strange things happened in the room. Doors slammed by themselves, glasses slipped from surfaces, small objects disappeared from their usual places to reappear in impossible corners. At night, the mist thickened so much that it looked like a viscous being prowling the house, and the sweet, metallic smell seeped through the cracks. The absolute silence of the forest was broken, from time to time, by a shuffling murmur coming from the windows, as if voices were calling his name or reciting incomprehensible phrases. The nocturnal marks on the walls began to take shape. They were circular designs, symbols similar to those of the red ribbons found on the trails, always reappearing after they were cleaned. Ethan realized that they were being made from the inside out, as if the house itself was trying to engrave his story on the boards, forcing him to see what had been denied for decades. A strong wind broke the night once, and the bedroom window slammed violently. As Ethan approached to close it, he saw in the reflection of the glass a figure standing a few feet from the balcony, thin, almost translucent, with incandescent yellow eyes in the fog. Fear paralyzed every muscle. He took a deep breath, looked again, but the thing was already moving towards the shore of the lake, each disjointed and silent movement sucking the little color from the landscape. The next morning, he found deep marks in the mud on the trail, like deformed human feet. Ethan felt the walls narrow with every breath. He remembered family stories only told roughly. They mentioned ancestors who sought their fortune far away, who disappeared without a trace. Perhaps that cabin was the breaking point in his past, a conscious secret between generations, and now, in the face of so many names and letters, there was no longer any denying it. He was there not only by chance, but as the heir of an unfinished narrative, perhaps as another one of those who could not leave when they needed to. The name Foster, scrawled on books, letters, and fogged windows, pulsed around him like a curse. So at dusk, with another wind shaking the house and the creature moving to the edge of the forest, Ethan realized that the connection between him, the cabin, and that entity was definitive, as if he had been called by something very old, which had finally decided to be noticed. The real reserve was the one between fear and memory, impossible to cross alone, and the more he searched for answers, the more the presence of the creature and the dark forces that prowled the forest seemed fueled by his own obsession. Everything conspired so that his arrival had never been by choice, but the fulfillment of a destiny engineered in the dark. The morning started heavy, an unreal wad encapsulating the hut as if a veil had descended over the world. Ethan woke up with his breath choked, his chest tightened as if he had spent the night running away from something inside his own dreams. Through the fogged windows, everything was grey, indistinct. The clock had inexplicably returned to always, marking the same time, 3:20 in the morning, even when the sky was already announcing noon. The coffee tasted like iron, and the sounds of the forest felt like non-stop whispers that penetrated the thick walls and buzzed inside her ears. Over the next few hours, an inexplicable restlessness pushed Ethan through each room. He no longer knew whether to seek answers or just try to ward off the nervous breakdown. The smell of wet earth and blood no longer left his nostrils. Objects trembled by themselves. The rocking chair, which the night before had seemed not to move, now creaked, at a gentle cadence with no wind on the porch boards. The curtains danced as if they were touched by invisible hands. As Ethan passed the mirror in the hallway, his own image flickered, blurred, changing subtly each time he dared to look at it, sometimes with sunken eyes and a delirious expression. Sometimes a yellow shadow pulsed behind the back of his neck, writhing and distancing as he approached. A dry stampede, wood-breaking, interrupted his inner chaos. He ran into the living room, panting, and found the picture frame fallen, the glass shattered, forming incomprehensible syllables on the carpet. When he picked it up, he no longer saw the original photo, but a blurry image of himself, standing at the door of the house, as if he were being watched from the inside. The latent panic echoed in every heartbeat. That same afternoon, the circular. Marks appeared on the walls, now no longer shy or scattered, but forming almost a luminous, pulsating trail that led him to the basement room. The air there was colder, heavy to the point of hurting. The shadows condensed, and in the dim light, Ethan saw the tall, squalid figure emerge at the opposite door, glowing eyes piercing the dark, long arms that almost touched the ground. Paralyzed by the vision, he wanted to look at any other point, but the creature's gaze held his like a shackle. The words of the old woman from the forest seeped into her mind. When they want to be seen, they always find a way. And now it was there, materialized before him, occupying the entire space, transforming the basement into the epicenter of terror. Trying to escape, he tripped over old boxes, falling on papers and old clothes, all impregnated by the same smell of rust and humidity. The figure approached, dissolving and remaking itself into a mass of shadows, muttering sentences in an ancient language, outlining in the air the symbols seen on the ribbons and walls. Ethan felt his skin sting on the ground. Suddenly, images filled his head. Evelyn and Harold walking through heavy mists, faces turning into masks of fear, families identical to those in the photos, all dragged slowly into the cabin, all being absorbed by the darkness of the surrounding forest. The entity seemed to manipulate him, stitching together old memories with newfound dread, scrambling the past to the point that Ethan could no longer distinguish his own memories from the impressions left by the house on others before him. When he ran back to the living room, the objects swirled by themselves in the air, papers climbed the walls, the books opened and closed the pages like hungry mouths. The light flickered in sickly shades of yellow and green. The image in the mirrors then no longer accompanied him. As he passed, he saw only the entity, motionless, posing behind him as if it had always belonged to his inner circle. The record of time has been lost. Ethan no longer knew if it was day or night, if he would sleep again or if he was already dreaming. As he lay on the couch to try to calm his heartbeat, he felt the mattress sink, as if another invisible presence reclined next to him. Low chants began to echo behind the walls, at first inaudible, then squeezing the eardrums until they almost became screams. He searched the old diaries, trying to recite aloud one of Evelyn's texts, like a desperate spell to protect himself. But each word uttered was immediately echoed in more than one voice. The voices of the forest, the voices of the ancestors, all in a dreadful chorus. When he finally gave in to fatigue and closed his eyes, he was swallowed up by visions. The lake boiling, bodies emerging from the water, half-transparent figures marching down the wood's path, all heading toward the hut. He saw himself, pale, dragging his feet like Harold decades before, repeating the fate of those who never managed to get out. An abrupt flash woke him, light that came from nowhere, but burned his eyes and prevented any rational thought. The walls of the cabin shook, objects vibrated, and the sound of the entity was now part of Ethan's own pulse. Totally enveloped. By presence, he felt that his desires no longer belonged to him. He no longer knew what was real and what was shadow, what was the present time, and what was just an inherited memory. The extreme fear was mixed with the vague recognition that, at that moment, he no longer had any control. The cabin had decided, and he understood with horror that he was no longer just a resident, but an inseparable part of the cycle that bound everyone there forever. Ethan's world no longer followed any known logic. The sounds of the hut were like dry thumps on his exhausted mind, and any attempt to distinguish dream from reality was futile. Evelyn's words resounded like a curse. "We are not the ones who live in the house. It lives in us." With each minute, Ethan felt more consumed, as if his story was being rewritten by the invisible force that pulsed between the damp walls. At the beginning of that dawn, with no beginning or end, Ethan found himself sitting on the floor of his room, his back glued to the door, trying to create a barrier between himself and the gloomy pulse coming from the hallway. The incandescent marks drawn on the walls now moved slowly, contorting ancestral symbols with the rhythm of his own breathing. She felt like a child, helpless in the face of the inevitable, reliving painful episodes of the past, the absent parents, the nights of fear in dark rooms, the isolated childhood where silence was a terrible companion. Suddenly muffled sounds echoed from across the door, distorted voices and laughter. Ethan struggled to remember who he was, trying to fix memories that no longer seemed to belong only to him. He looked around, searching for anything to prove. His identity, childhood photos, favorite books, but each object now seemed an empty imitation, part of some cruel theater staged around the house. The fear was absolute, but a spark of anger began to germinate under the terror. He didn't want to give in completely. Outside, the entity wandered, projecting Ethan's greatest insecurities and wounds into the environment. The figure walked the corridors, assuming different faces. Sometimes the father figure who had abandoned him. Sometimes the ex-girlfriend, cold and distant. Sometimes a distorted reflection of himself, drowned in guilt and regret. Whispers ran through his thoughts. "You were never enough. No one ever comes back for you. This house is your destiny, because it's all you deserve." Ethan squints, choking, until a familiar, delicate voice erupts through the chaos within. The memory of his mother reciting old verses to calm him, saying that in the end, no one is really alone. He grasps this fragment of peace tightly, focusing on what he has always secretly nurtured, the will to break the cycle of abandonment, to be stronger than the corrosive silence of the past. When he gets up, driven almost by instinct, he realizes that something has changed. The shadows recede briefly, as if fear has lost some of its flavor. The entity hesitates, floating on the edge of the corridor, always watching. Ethan understands that in order to cross the invisible barrier of the cabin, he must first cross his own. He walks through the house, even with the mocking voices and the insane scratching coming from all sides. At every step, the dark memories try to drag him back. He sees himself at the age of 8, curled up under his bed. He reviews the sudden end of the relationship that threw him into exile. He feels again the loneliness crowning his bones in the coldest days of his youth. But now he faces each memory, faces the pain, and in each one he repeats to himself that he is not just a victim, that there is a choice even where there seems to be nothing. The house reacts, shivering, the lights flashing so hard that they make the air electronic and dense. Shards of glass scratch the hallway, furniture moves on its own, blocking obvious routes. However, Ethan follows, guided by newfound courage, mixed with panic. He feels like he needs to go to the basement where it all seems to have begun. As he descends the steps, shadows weigh down his shoulders, leaning against his skin and trying to shove malleable tentacles into his mind. Ethan takes a deep breath, fights the feeling of suffocation, and repeats, like a mantra, the fragment of his mother's phrase. He arrives before the entity, which now looms large in front of the pile of albums and ancestral letters. Eyes, multiple and flaming, spinning like the orbits of an impossible universe. The fight ceases to be physical. It becomes an internal confrontation. The presence tries to invade Ethan's thoughts once and for all, remembering every abandonment, every failure, every limit imposed by years of loneliness. But he screams, for the first time in a long time, using his own voice instead of choking it. The cry is not just fear or pain, but an affirmation of resistance, a refusal to lose oneself, like so many before him. When you verbalize your pain, something breaks. The memories, manipulated by the house, no longer have the same paralyzing force. With difficulty, Ethan approaches one of the symbols on the wall and, with his hand bloodied by the effort of pushing debris, draws on the central point as if erasing an old spell. The environment sways, the shadows scream, the creature retreats. In a last-ditch effort, Ethan lumbers to the door of the cabin, stumbling among the fallen furniture and shards, his breath in spasms. He feels weak, but something inside him resists, knowing that the end of that cycle depends on refusing to give in to fear. The doorknob, which had so often slipped and seemed distant, now turns under his trembling hand. He hears the final whisper, the entity trying to convince him that the outside world doesn't exist, that he's part of that scenario. But Ethan closes his eyes, faces the inner terror, and opens the door. The air of the forest, humid and cold, invades the house, and for a few seconds, the silence outside seems more alive than all the cacophony of the cabin. He doesn't know what awaits him beyond the threshold, but he took the most difficult step. He confronted what had always held him captive. The internal struggle echoes, while the struggle to escape, physical and emotional, remains, but a fissure has opened, and now there is hope. The biting wind from the forest hit Ethan's face as soon as the door finally opened, but the feeling of freedom lasted as little as a sigh. As he crossed the threshold, he realized that the world outside looked distorted, as seen through a wet glass. The trees bent forward, forming tortuous tunnels, and the ground rattled beneath their feet, as if the earth itself breathed in sync with the hut, wanting to drag it back inside. The fog was so thick that shapes could almost be seen moving inside, it peering with glowing eyes and long fingers reaching out to touch it. Ethan realized that the cabin didn't end where its walls did. It was part of that forgotten soil and the surrounding gloomy forest. The sky, though livid, seemed to bend over him, sucking his will as he moved away from the porch. Each step was a challenge, and even though he had overcome the first barrier within him, he felt the past and the echoes of the entity cling to his ankles. The trail to the lake, once misty, now appeared violently clear, illuminated by a cold light that did not heat, only lashed. As he walked, Ethan felt the mounting pressure of presence, the air pulsing with murmurs of all the voices that had ever screamed, cried, and pleaded. It was the forest itself, all around, steeped in the living, sick consciousness of the hut. The entity, sensing the challenge, manifested itself without subterfuge. As if emerging from the mist, it took shape before Ethan, its yellow eyes burning. Like hell lamps, its thin limbs stretching to infinity, and its features changing faces by the second. His mother, his fathers, Evelyn, Harold, each absent relative, and finally, Ethan himself, pale, duplicated, staring at him with blank eyes. The shock was visceral. Ethan fell to his knees, his legs softened by terror and disbelief. The entity whispered in all known and unknown voices, "Nothing out there belongs to you. This is the end of all who dared to wake up this soil. You have always been fear that holds you captive." All around, pine trees curved, the sounds of the forest turned to chants and moans. The entity moved forward, and Ethan felt his mind about to fragment for good, recent and old memories exploding like crushed glass in his head. The frightened child, the abandoned adult, the lonely man in the cabin, all intertwined into one. It was then that, between one wave and another of horror, Ethan realized the decision he needed to make. He had crossed the physical border, but the real threshold was the fear that the entity repeated with each generation. The dread of facing himself, the need to flee or give in. Ethan understood that to break the cycle, he would have to do the opposite of what the survival instinct screamed for. Not resist, but accept, face the loss, the abandonment, the emptiness that haunted. His life there at the core of everything. With supreme effort he stood up, despite his trembling legs, his gaze fixed on the entity's changing eyes. The creature laughed, the trees shuddering with it, but Ethan pressed forward until he stood before it, a few inches from the glowing eyes. "I don't run away anymore," he declared in a pasty tone, his voice wavering but firm. "It can show me everything. It can make me feel everything. But I am not your hostage." Every word was a blow, an act of surrender and defiance at the same time. The forest seemed to tremble, a dry thunder breaking the silence, and the entity hesitated, its body made of mist and shadow vacillating between shapes and voices. Ethan felt a flood of memories and nightmares run through his mind. The moments of rejection, the losses never overcome, the visceral sense of loneliness. But instead of retreating, he stood in front of him, feeling everything, accepting, breathing with the pain. He narrated to himself, almost in a trance, everything he had experienced, everything that hurt, and at that apex, his presence tore the veil imposed by the entity. So, the battle turned, not by force, but by the weight of acceptance. The creature bellowed, the twisted voices now pleading, trying to entice him to retreat, offering false comfort, whispering familiar lies. "You have nowhere to turn. Only I can protect you." But Ethan denied it, reaffirmed his loneliness, admitted his fear, defied the horror. "I'd rather be free in emptiness than eternal, where it's not me." The moment it took over its own abyss, the entity screamed and broke into 1,000 fragments of shadow and light, exploding around in whirlpools. The ground seemed to tremble. The forest retreated, the mist dissipated briefly, revealing a clear fragment of clearing where the moon beat and illuminated Ethan's wet face. He fell to his knees, feeling the unbearable pressure suddenly subside, his body exhausted and his mind exhausted by the confrontation. The echo of the decision spread. He knew that nothing would be the same as before, that something inside him was left behind, sacrificing the unknown comfort of isolation and pain to experience at least once real freedom. The impact of the choice was as devastating as it was liberating. I would never be that previous person. I would never be that whole man again. But the pieces that remained were free. Ethan lifted his face to the open sky, took a deep breath, and realized through tears and relief that he had finally managed to do what decades of fear had prevented him: face his demons, make his own choices, and finally leave the cabin behind. The cold wind that ran through the trees of the clearing seemed to clear the weight that had oppressed Ethan for so long. The silence was now different. It carried the vague promise of normality, even if normality was never fully possible again. Ethan stood there on his knees for minutes that seemed like hours, listening to his own heart, drumming in his chest heaving, his head spinning with the strangeness of this unexpected relief. The shadows receded, the whispers ceased, and the hut, that center of pain and despair, had become just another old building in the dark forest. Ethan turned and studied her from a distance, looking for something familiar, some visible mark that would attest to everything he faced. But there were no supernatural signs there, only the weathered facade, the damaged windows, the pitched roof under years of neglect. It was hard to believe that within that space so many lives had been lost or found, that so many voices cried. Out on the walls, when his senses finally settled, Ethan stood, testing his own body as someone learning to walk for the first time. Every muscle ached, and the air felt heavier than ever, but there was an unknown clarity within it. Memories came in waves, the episodes of childhood, the horrors of the house, the nocturnal confrontations with the entity. Everything was there, but now diluted, embedded as part of a narrative greater than simple pain. He walked to the lake, attracted by the silver reflection that stretched out like a dark mirror. The lake seemed like so many others, but now it was a symbol of transformation, as if the black surface held the stories of all those who dared to reach that point. Under his feet, the ground throbbed softly, as if the place itself was adapting, assimilating the decision made. Ethan knelt on the bank, looked at the reflection, and for the first time he saw no shadow of the monster in the hut, no terrified child, but only a scarred man, a survivor, his eyes swollen from weeping and weary from combat, but alive. The morning began to open small gaps in the forest, shy beams of light that shone through the trees. Ethan realized it was time to leave. He took what little he had left along the way, an abandoned backpack, Evelyn's diary, a photograph from ancient times almost faded, and followed the trail back to the road, not looking back. He did not know what he would find ahead, or even if, when he left the forest, he would find the world the same as he knew. His soul was wounded, perhaps irreparable in certain corners, but there was something new and strange burning there. A flame that was not one of empty hope, but of continuity. He was changed. As he walked, the silence was slowly filled by the sound of his own footsteps, which contrasted with the otherworldly noise of the hut. Birds began to sing, the light became less hostile, and the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But Ethan felt, under his skin, small sparks of restlessness, an intuition that nothing is definitively buried, that certain secrets continue to pulse, even if they are dormant. When he reached the edge of the forest, he stopped in front of an old moss-covered fence, recognizing the way back to the city. He can hear in the distance the roar of an engine, perhaps some early bird truck on the highway. The world had not stopped, nor bowed before its destiny. Life went on, indifferent to the terror he experienced. Ethan stopped, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. Back in the city, the daily routine was almost surreal. People walked in a hurry. The noises of civilization competed with the inner silence that was now part of it. Ethan rented a simple room in an inn, tried to sleep, for the first time on a bed of clean, straight sheets. During the night, he dreamed of endless corridors full of doors, each leading back to the cabin, and woke up several times, certain that he would never completely get rid of those whispers. Worse, sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she heard a muffled laugh that seemed to drag across the floor next to her bed. Days later, he sat down in a coffee shop to scribble some notes on a notepad, trying to record the experience and organize the facts. He looked at the faces around him and wondered how many there carried unseen terrors, how many had already faced their own monsters, and how many were doomed to repeat cycles of fear. In a brief conversation with the owner of the place, he heard that the old forest path was closed again, that some animals were found dead shortly after his departure, and that a strange sensation hovered over the region. Ethan listened in silence, trying to push away the shiver. In the middle of everything, I learned of a young woman who had recently arrived in the city. They said that she had come in search of seclusion, that she was staying in a temporary cottage, a little beyond the old reservation. Remembering himself and all the trappings of isolation, Ethan tried to warn her in a quick, casual conversation, but she smiled with a certain disdain, saying that she was not superstitious and that solitude was just what she needed. Ethan watched her walk away towards the trail. Her instinct wanted to follow her, to prevent others from falling into the same cycle, but she knew that there were limits to interference. Some paths need to be traveled so that we can free ourselves from the most intimate prisons, he thought, as the figure disappeared among the trees where the fog began to form again, dense and slow. That night, Ethan dreamed of the cabin again. But this time, as he approached the door, it was no longer locked. He felt a short relief until he saw, inside, a pair of eyes glowing in the dark, the same ones he faced, now attentive, silent, waiting for the next visitor. When he woke up, the echo of the whispers was still there, discreet, muffled, but pulsating on the walls of his own room, and Ethan understood that the reserve and what lives in it never completely disappears. They just wait. If you enjoyed this story full of mysteries and goosebumps, don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any releases, and come be part of our community. Here you discover exclusive content, exchange ideas with a crowd passionate about suspense and horror, and even stay on top of everything that happens in the universe of dark stories. So let's go, click there, be part of this family, and embark with us on more breathtaking adventures.